A review of Michael D. Alcantara's The Problem Resolving Solution. Transform life's problems into clarity, balance, and momentum. Michael Alcantara's The Problem Resolving Solution enters the crowded literature of personal effectiveness, behavioral change, and decision-making. Its governing proposition, however, is more substantial than the familiar promise of self-improvement. Alcantara argues that problems occur again because individuals frequently address immediate manifestations without reconsidering the assumptions, behaviors, and decision patterns that reproduce them. His problem-resolving system, PRS, accordingly treats effective action as a recursive process of interpretation, choice, movement, feedback, and recalibration. The book is neither an academic monograph nor simply motivational literature. It is a practitioner-oriented synthesis combining personal narrative, behavioral classification, management tools, reflective exercises, and a structured decision process. Its contribution lies not in advancing a new theory of decision-making, but in integrating familiar elements into a coherent method of individual decision practice. Although Alcantara situates the book among works such as James Clear's Atomic Habits, Simon Sinek's Start With Why, Spencer Johnson's Who Moved My Cheese, and Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F***, those comparisons only partially locate its intellectual content. PRS is fundamentally concerned with decision under conditions of incomplete information, imperfectly ordered goals, behavioral constraint, and uncertainty. In those respects, Herbert Simon and James March provide a more productive disciplinary frame. Alcantara begins by distinguishing solving, resolving, and resolving. Solving addresses the immediate problem. Resolving addresses its residual effects. Resolving asks why the same or a recognizably similar problem continues to recur. The distinction changes the unit of analysis. The problem is no longer exclusively external, but includes the decision-maker's interpretation, timing, assumptions, and characteristic response. PRS therefore rejects the decision as a terminal event. Consequences become information for subsequent action. Its procedural core is a 5-stage sequence: recognize, clarify, choose, move, recalibrate. Recognition defines the problem. Clarification considers circumstances and available information. Choice establishes a direction without requiring certainty. Movement converts decision into action. Recalibration incorporates consequences into the next iteration. The larger system consists of 8 components: mission, motive, method, mentality, model, movement, mapping, and maintenance. Mission supplies direction. Motive links purpose and identity. Method establishes structure. Mentality concerns mindset. Model identifies behavioral tendencies. Movement produces execution. Mapping organizes decision techniques, and maintenance sustains the process. Alcantara's extended vehicle metaphor presents these as interdependent rather than additive elements. The framework is recognizably managerial. Mission, method, movement, monitoring, and recalibration correspond broadly to planning, organizing, directing, control, and corrective action. Yet Alcantara's concern is less formal administration of organizations than the regulation of the actor who must decide. This is where Simon becomes the critical interpretive pivot. Simon's administrative behavior displaced the omniscient administrator of classical rationality with a decision-maker operating under cognitive and organizational constraints. Information is incomplete. Alternatives are costly to identify. Consequences cannot be calculated exhaustively, and attention itself is scarce. Decision-makers therefore satisfice rather than optimize. They terminate search when an alternative satisfies an acceptable set of requirements. PRS begins with comparable conditions. Alcantara's decision-maker cannot wait for complete knowledge and is repeatedly instructed to identify a sufficiently defensible course and act. Recognition and clarification bound the problem. Choice terminates search. Movement prevents analysis from becoming indefinite. Recalibration acknowledges that the initial choice was necessarily made with incomplete knowledge. PRS is thus procedurally rather than comprehensively rational. The resemblance should not be mistaken for equivalence. Simon located bounded rationality within administrative organizations, where choice is shaped by authority, communication, organizational premises, routines, and the alternatives that reach attention. Alcantara relocates much of the constraint within the individual. Fear, fatigue, identity, urgency, excessive reflection, impulsivity, and incomplete self-awareness. PRS is therefore not an organizational restatement of Simon, but a practitioner translation of the decision problem Simon placed at the center of administrative analysis. James March extends the comparison beyond constrained calculation. March's work emphasizes that decisions are not governed exclusively by expected consequences. They also express identities, roles, rules, and judgments of appropriateness. March and Simon's organizations had already established the behavioral foundations of this approach by treating organizational actors as boundedly rational participants whose attention, expectations, and choices are structured by organizational settings. March's later distinction between a logic of consequences and a logic of appropriateness is particularly useful for PRS. Mission, method, movement, mapping, and maintenance are predominantly consequential. They connect objectives with processes, action, monitoring, and correction. Motive, mentality, and the behavioral quadrant model introduce identity and appropriateness. They ask who is acting, what values are implicated, and whether the actor's present behavioral posture fits the situation. This makes Alcantara's concept of motive theoretically more interesting than its self-help vocabulary initially suggests. Motive is not simply motivation, but the relation between purpose and identity. PRS consequently treats decisions not merely as selections among alternatives, but as enactments of the decision-maker's conception of self. March also exposes a limitation. Alcantara generally assumes that greater self-awareness can bring purpose and identity into alignment. Managerial decisions frequently present legitimate but irreconcilable claims. Profitability against employment stability, institutional survival against professional standards, transparency against confidentiality, or present security against long-term development. Identity may therefore complicate rather than resolve choice. PRS recognizes identity, but gives less attention to ambiguity among competing identities and rules of appropriateness. The behavioral quadrant model is Alcantara's most distinctive device. It identifies four situational postures: the fearful avoider, reflective thinker, impulsive actor, and balanced achiever. These are not presented as fixed personality types. Rather, they describe positions from which a person may approach a particular problem. Its practical value lies in refusing to make either reflection or action intrinsically desirable. Reflection may improve judgment or become delay. Speed may restore movement or prematurely terminate inquiry. Alcantara's example of an individual deliberately shifting from excessive thoroughness to faster execution as a time constraint becomes salient illustrates the contingent character of the model. Effectiveness depends upon the fit among task, information, urgency, consequence, and behavioral posture. Read through Simon, the quadrants describe recognizable failures of search and choice. The reflective thinker continues searching after the marginal value of additional information has declined. The impulsive actor terminates search prematurely. The fearful avoider resists entering the decision process. The balanced achiever attempts to fit deliberation and action to the problem. This is a useful heuristic, although the categories are not empirically validated and should not be mistaken for a psychological taxonomy. Charles Lindblom provides a related connection. His science of muddling through challenged the comprehensive rational expectation that decision-makers could establish a complete hierarchy of values, enumerate all alternatives, calculate consequences, and then select an optimum. Practical decision-making proceeds through limited comparisons and successive approximation. Alcantara's insistence upon the next intentional step follows a comparable logic. PRS requires sufficient clarity to move, not exhaustive analysis before movement. The difference in level is important. Lindblom addressed policymaking amid plural values and dispersed authority. Alcantara converts incrementalism into a method of individual decision practice. Nevertheless, incremental action provides a bridge between bounded rationality and recalibration. Because the initial choice is made under limitation, it remains provisional. Action itself produces information. The limitation of incrementalism also applies to PRS. Successive adjustment may reduce uncertainty while leaving a fundamentally defective arrangement intact. Some problems require discontinuity rather than calibration. A more developed version of PRS would distinguish reversible decisions appropriate for experimentation from high-consequence decisions requiring more extensive inquiry and from circumstances demanding immediate structural intervention. Alcantara supplements the 5-stage cycle with a 4A framework: anticipate, activate, advance, achieve, which functions as the movement engine of PRS. The framework addresses an important managerial problem: the transition from decision to implementation. Conceptually, however, its stages overlap with the larger PRS cycle. Anticipation reproduces elements of recognition and clarification. Activation approximates choice and movement. Advancement sustains execution. Achievement eventually returns to recalibration. The additional framework may be pedagogically useful, but it contributes to conceptual proliferation. More significant is the feedback structure underlying PRS. Action produces consequences. Consequences become information, and information modifies subsequent action. Alcantara treats resistance and setback as data rather than merely failure. In that respect, PRS bears an evident family resemblance to continuous improvement models, although its focus remains the individual rather than organizational process variation. This individual emphasis creates an analytical risk. A manager may not be stalled because of mentality, behavioral posture, or deficient persistence. The information system may be defective. Incentives may contradict objectives. Resources may be inadequate. Authority may be ambiguous, or organizational demands may be internally inconsistent. A theory of managerial self-correction cannot substitute for analysis of the system being managed. The concept of recalibration nonetheless offers PRS its greatest theoretical potential. It approaches Argyris and Sean's distinction between single-loop and double-loop learning. Single-loop learning detects a discrepancy and modifies action while leaving underlying assumptions intact. Double-loop learning subjects those assumptions and governing values to examination. PRS clearly incorporates the former. Action is assessed and modified according to result. Its distinction between solving and resolving occasionally moves toward the latter by asking whether the original definition of the problem or the recurring assumptions behind it must themselves be reconsidered. The distinction is not consistently maintained. Recalibration may refer to adjustment in effort or timing, or it may imply reconsideration of mission, identity, and problem definition. The theoretical architecture would be strengthened by distinguishing 3 levels: operational correction, in which an action is modified; strategic reconsideration, in which the method is reconsidered; and premise reflection, in which the framing of the problem or its governing assumptions is revised. Such a distinction would give resolving greater analytical content and connect it more directly to the organizational learning literature. The popular works Alcantara acknowledges remain relevant, but mainly as the immediate publishing context. Atomic Habits shares PRS's preference for systems over episodic motivation, but concentrates more narrowly on mechanisms of repeated behavior. Start with Why anticipates the emphasis upon purpose, but is less concerned with recurrent decision processes. Who Moved My Cheese supplies a model of adaptation that Alcantara complicates by insisting that movement without reflection may itself become dysfunctional. Manson's subtle art shares an emphasis upon values and selective commitment, but remains philosophically skeptical, where Alcantara is procedural. PRS is broader than each, although that breadth comes at the cost of theoretical precision. Alcantara grounds the system in autobiography, poverty, immigration, military experience, business, leadership, family, and personal failure. This gives the work experiential rather than scholarly authority. His discussion of his grandfather George L. Germain's will do framework is especially pertinent because Alcantara explicitly presents PRS as an extension of an earlier emphasis upon inventory, planning, commitment, and execution, adding behavioral awareness and recalibration. That experiential foundation explains the book's practical strength. Its chapter exercises, summaries, worksheets, and diagrams substantially reduce the distance between conceptual discussion and use. The final worksheet integrates priorities, quadrant identification, action, planning, intention, and reflection into a repeatable routine. Experience, however, does not establish general validity. The behavioral quadrant model, the 4A framework, and the integrated PRS architecture are presented without empirical validation. Similarly, claims involving identity, cognition, burnout, resilience, and decision behavior would require stronger engagement with the relevant research literature before PRS could be evaluated as a tested behavioral model. Its most important theoretical limitation remains the level of analysis. PRS is principally a model of individual self-management. Organizational decisions, by contrast, are structured by authority, communication, routines, bargaining, resource distribution, professional norms, coalitions, and power. A March, Simon analysis asks not merely what the decision-maker should do, but who defines the problem, which alternatives reach attention, whose preferences become decision premises, where relevant information resides, and who possesses authority to commit the organization. PRS does not systematically address those questions. That limitation should define rather than diminish its contribution. The problem-resolving solution is consequently best read neither as a validated psychological theory nor simply as another motivational handbook. It is a synthetic framework for managerial self-regulation. Herbert Simon supplies its clear scholarly point of entry. PRS assumes a bounded decision-maker unable to possess complete information, calculate every consequence, or postpone action indefinitely. Alcantara's response is procedural. Define the problem sufficiently, clarify the immediate conditions, select a workable direction, act, and treat consequences as information. March expands that interpretation by revealing the importance of identity and appropriateness alongside expected consequences. Alcantara's mission and method predominantly serve consequential reasoning. Motive, mentality, and behavioral posture acknowledge that decisions also enact identities and values. PRS does not thereby constitute a new contribution to the March-Simon tradition in the conventional sense. It offers neither an empirically tested theory of organizational choice nor an analysis of routines, coalitions, attention structures, and institutional authority. Its contribution is synthetic and translational. It relocates several established problems of management decision theory within the individual practitioner. Determination of search, the relation between deliberation and action, the influence of identity upon choice, and the use of feedback to revise subsequent behavior. The fairest academic characterization is therefore modest but consequential. PRS is a practitioner-oriented framework of managerial decision-making that integrates bounded rationality, identity-based choice, behavioral self-awareness, contingent action, incremental adjustment, and feedback-based learning. It is considerably more developed as a model of managerial self-regulation than as a theory of organizational decision-making. Its further development would require less conceptual proliferation, clearer distinctions among levels of recalibration, empirical examination of the quadrant and 4A models, an extension from the bounded individual decision-maker to the institutional conditions within which managerial choices are actually made.